Welcome everyone to this evening's panel for World Water Day. It's called Water and Peace, Indigenous and Western. Father Darrell Winkler is actually the operator of our Zoom platform, and he will welcome you on behalf of our parish and get us going with the land acknowledgement. Then he has to leave for a while, but he'll probably rejoin before the end of our discussion. So over to you, Father Darrell.
Okay, Father Darrell, I'm pastor at St. Basil's Parish, and I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to this Zoom session. We at St. Basil's Parish regard the love of God to be the foundation of all life and all ministry. We believe in the ever-present love of God as witnessed through Christ and empowered by the Holy Spirit. We believe that each person is loved by God and is of sacred worth. Therefore, through God's grace, we welcome all people to our parish. We express God's hospitality by creating a safe, healing, accessible, and transforming place for all who enter. Further, we acknowledge with gratitude and respect that we gather here on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory, and we uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to proceed now to our program. I'm going to give you a short orientation, and then our speakers are Dr. Christine Jamieson and Dr. Tom McAuley, whom I'll introduce. And I think that may take up to an hour for their presentations, and then we'll have our question and answer. And then thanks from Pamela Dixon. This evening is arranged by the Laudato Si Water Action Group. This began in 2018, 2020, when Father Darrell asked me to try and do some things that would acknowledge and build on Laudato Si having appeared in 5 years earlier in 2015. And what emerged was the idea that we wanted to have both awareness and study, but also action. And so that has been occurring in a few groups for a while, and now it's actually two groups. One is called Indigenous Awareness, and the other one is Water Action. Tom McAuley, who you'll hear from later, and Pamela Dixon, who will do the thanks at the end, are my colleagues on this small but powerful Water Action Group, and we welcome other people to join us if you would. It's very interesting to interact on these very important matters, I should say. We've worked on World Water Day celebrations last year and the previous year. This is the third in the series, and so we hope that you'll enjoy it very much and benefit a lot from it. Now, I was going to play you a song by the Nova Scotia folklorist and musician Clary Croft, but I can't seem to make the whole thing work. I tried in various ways. And so guess what? I'm going to sing it to you. But if you want to hear his version, just check on the internet for Clary Croft and you'll find it quite easily. And here's how this meditative song goes. I go down to the river, stand beside her shore, seeking inspiration as so many have before, and she washes for me, makes my spirit lift, I bow my head and thank for the gift. There we go. Thank you for the applause there, Pamela. Good. And thank you, Clary Croft, for permitting us to use this in a form that you didn't anticipate. So now I'm going to switch over to introducing our two speakers. And Christine Jamieson is quite well known in some circles for her work on Indigenous spirituality, although she's also done a lot in various areas of bioethics. As this little blurb from the Concordia University website says, she explores foundational issues concerning human identity and human dignity through various lenses. And for our purposes, The relevant point is that since 2010, she's been doing research and writing on Indigenous themes relating to ethics and spirituality. She has taught on this matter since 2014 and is currently writing a book on it. Tom McAuley is someone I ran into quite a few years ago at St. Paul University when there was something going on that had to do with Bernard Lonergan and/or environmental issues. I can't really remember, but he's become a good friend and colleague with Pamela and myself. He has a background in science and engineering and was the senior water resources engineer advisor for the International Joint Commission for a dozen years. And we'll be hearing about that experience shortly. After retiring, he took philosophy and theology studies at St. Paul's and did a doctoral thesis on this topic in connection with Bernard Lonergan, using his philosophical foundations and theology as well. And I think this quote from the abstract is worth looking at because it gives you an orientation not only to what you're going to hear from him, but to the whole evening. There is an overarching need for a new water ethic, a need to go beyond utilitarianist and anthropocentric those approaches, and a need to clarify the roles of theology and philosophy at a time when water governance is called to be fair and participatory in the multicultural, multi-religious world of fresh water. So there you have it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Tom, are you going to be going first? I'd asked the two of you to settle that, so I'm at your service.
I think I was going to go first, if I'm not mistaken. So
Okay.
I'll go ahead then, and I'll share my screen. Let me just do that because I have a little PowerPoint here.
Yes, you've started sharing.
Okay, good. And I'm just going to,
Yep, you're getting close. Bit to the left. Oh,
there we go. Is that good?
it's working fine. Thank you very much. I'm going to mute myself and over to you.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just having a little bit of problem here with something that's in my way. Just hold on a second. Apologies. Just a minute. I'm really sorry about this. There's just something blocking my vision here for my slides.
Pamela, do you see the slides properly?
Yeah, I think it's me that can't see them. I have the participant name up there, and that's what's getting in my way.
Can you click on participants and somehow get rid of that?
I think what I'll do is I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. I apologize about this. Get rid of that. Okay, I'll go back now.
You know, you can pay me to sing the song again while you're working on that, or pay me not to sing it again. Go to the left to where it says slideshow. Oh, no, a bit to the right. You're almost there. A bit more to the right.
It's just the, oh yeah, I got it here. Okay.
And then
all right, good. Very good.
You're all set. Fantastic. Thank you, Christine.
All right. Thank you. And so tonight I just want to share a little bit about Indigenous spirituality in relation to water. And necessarily, when we think about Indigenous spirituality, it includes everything. It includes how we behave, how we are in relationship to everything. So I'm not only speaking about spirituality, I'm also going to be speaking about ethics and our way of being in relationship to water. So you'll see that comes out. So it's all really, for Indigenous people, there's no separation between spirituality and ethics and ways of being in the world. So you'll see that as I move forward. So I'm going to speak a little bit first about water, the word itself, from a Cree and Anishinaabe perspective. Then I want to speak a little bit about this notion that water speaks. I want to look a little bit at different worldviews. I want to look at the Mother Earth Water Walk, or Women's Water Walk, which is a walk that's been going on since 2003, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about our relationship with water, and then finally the significance of water in Indigenous creation stories. So I wanted to start with this quote from Nicholas Black Elk. Nicholas Black Elk is Lakota. He was a medicine man and a holy man. He lived in the 19th century and part of the 20th century. And I thought this quote kind of really gives us a good sense of Indigenous spirituality. He says, we should understand well that all things are the work of the Great Spirit. We should know that He is within all things, the trees, the grasses, the rivers, the mountains, and all the four-legged animals and the winged peoples. And even more important, we should understand that he is above all these things and peoples. When we do understand all this deeply in our hearts, then we will fear and love and know the Great Spirit, and then we will be able, then we will act, then we will be and act and live as the Great Spirit intends. So I thought that was a good quote, just to kind of give us a sense of this idea that we are in relationship with all things, and that includes water and land and trees and grasses, etc. And they all are filled with the spirit of the Great Spirit. They all have spirits themselves. Very much an Indigenous perspective. Now, in the Cree language, the word for water is Nibi. And in the Anishinaabe language, it's very similar. It's also pronounced Nibi, but it's spelt a little bit differently. But here what the word, we understand that water is the essence of life, both material and spiritual. And the language itself reveals something about that. In Indigenous languages, the meaning is in the sound itself. It's in the word. The word is not a symbol for meaning, which has been abstracted out of the word, which tends to be the European languages tends to abstract. So water, water is a symbol. The word itself is a symbol for these things where this entity that we call lakes and oceans and rivers, etc., these entities. But for Indigenous languages, the meaning and the word are together in one experience. So if we look at the Cree word for Nibi, the Ni, the Ni, means I or I am. And then the B, Nibi, the B part of the word, means life. So it's understood as I am life. So water then, from a Cree and Anishinaabe perspective, the words they use, what those words mean is that water is life. They mean I am life. And so water, in a sense, is saying I am life. We can see this also in the Anishinaabe word Zagi Idawin, which is a word for love. In the Anishinaabe, for the Anishinaabe people, Zagi Idawin means unconditional love between one another, including all creation, human and non-humans. So the word again, if we break down the word, it points to what love is. The word actually explains, it describes and explains what love is. The word zag, the vowel zag, means to emerge or come out or flow out of. So it's like the mouth of a river. And idi means in a reciprocal way. So there's a relationship there. So the Anishinaabe word for the mouth of the river is called Zagin, which is very similar to Zagi. And so the mouth of the river, if we think about what the mouth of a river is, it's a place of great life. These waters carry organic and other life-giving matter and help nourish a more abundant life. So you see at the mouth of rivers, you see fish, birds, plants, and animals that gather at great river mouths in substantial numbers to draw off of the sustaining energy that the river mouth provides. So this is what the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe word Zagidiwin points to, that is that love is like the mouth of a river, in the sense that it has a sustaining energy, all the sustaining and the goodness that comes out of the river mouth is like love. Love is like that it's sustaining, and it flows out and sustains and nourishes all that's around it. So it's interesting to think about these Indigenous words and how they're really descriptive. They're very they come from the land, and they're descriptive of the land. And when I speak about land, I also mean water and everything that's on creation, everything that's on the earth. So water speaks. Water is one of the four elements that are very sacred to Indigenous peoples. Many Indigenous peoples' ceremonies involve water. For example, water walks, and I'm going to speak about that in a few minutes, about the women's water walks, but also water ceremonies. For example, in my part of the country, in the West Coast, there's what's called the annual first fish ceremony, or it's also called the salmon ceremony. So this ceremony is believed to ensure that the salmon run for the future, and the ceremony honors the place in which the salmon are caught. So there's also salmon calling ceremonies, and there's also the Cherokee people have what's called the going to the water rite. And here it's a cleansing rite, which is usually preceded by a period of fasting by the participants. So the actual ceremony is performed at the edge of a creek where the source of water is free flowing. And it's timed to coincide with spiritually potent illumination of sunrise. So the participants submerge themselves or pour water over themselves between 4 and 7 times. So and also there's the ceremony often when, in many Indigenous groups, when the child is born, they take the baby down to the water and they dunk the baby into the water. And the water is said to give the baby strength. The water shares its life with the baby and its energy. So also many Indigenous people's ceremonies involve, in terms of water, sweat lodges. Some of you probably are very familiar with sweat lodges. So this is an enclosure where these what they call grandfather rocks are heated very, very hot and placed into this enclosure. It's like a round sort of a tent in a way, and the rocks are placed in there, and water is poured over the rocks, and the steam rises up, and that's the experience of when one is in a sweat lodge, is that it's a healing experience, because one sweats all the toxins out of one's body, and it's not only physical, but it's also psychological. So these are just examples of, ceremonies that involve water, and there's many, 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 many ceremonies and all Indigenous peoples have ceremonies that involve water. So water then is considered the blood of Mother Earth, and as such, it cleanses not only the water, but also all living things. Water is the lifeblood, animating us as human beings and all that is around us. So water speaks. Our landscape, including water, shapes our worldview. This is a quote from Anna Mongebello, which speaks to that. And again, when she's speaking about land, when we speak about our relationship to the land, we include water, trees, plants, everything that is on the earth. So often when people speak about land, when Indigenous people speak about land, they're thinking also about water. So in this quote, Anna says, the language of the land is an ancient voice coming from the trees and from all the features of the landscape. It tells the stories of the origins of the world to the people who are entitled to be its interpreters. As diverse local ecosystems shape different worldview patterns, Indigenous languages are the expression of the relationship that First Peoples have with specific local ecosystems. And again, this includes the water that we're surrounded by. As a matter of fact, Indigenous worldviews, languages, and knowledge are embedded in the ecological sensibilities. An understanding of these forces is essential to an understanding of Indigenous narratives. So this is an important quote, I think, just in terms of our understanding that, the ancient voice that comes from the land, that teaches us, from the water, that teaches us something about who we are as a people. For Indigenous people, then, water is constantly communicating. Our lives depend on learning its language. I'm going to speak a little bit later about how water is both a positive and sometimes can be a negative force in our lives. And so we need to learn the language of water in order to be able to be in relationship to water in a good way, so that we can be safe in the water. So water, Jeanette Armstrong says, water is a physical and spiritual entity communicating through the voices of the grandmothers. So water is intrinsically connected to women. Women are the life givers of community, of the peoples. And so women are responsible for waters. And I'll speak a little bit more about that a bit later. But that's why Jeanette Armstrong says that water is a physical and spiritual entity communicating through the voices of the grandmothers. So water is nurturing, it's spiritual, it's a foundational source of our sense of self. The meaning of water for Indigenous peoples is that it's a traditional waters are a part of culture. So for Indigenous peoples, traditional waters are part of their culture. And it's all local. So I mean, right now I'm looking out over well, it's getting dark, so I can't see it as well right now, but I look over the St. Lawrence River. So this is the land of the Haudenosaunee people. And so for them, the water that gives them life is the St. Lawrence River. They would call it something else, but it's that, so that idea. So they're local, the local water, the water that we live near and live by is part of our culture. The traditional waters are part of the people themselves. Water has an emotional and spiritual value for Indigenous peoples. And water is as much a process as an entity. There's a dynamic there in water. There's again, I come back to that word relationship. There's a relationship with water. There's a process where we are in relationship with water. It's not just this thing out there, this entity out there, but it's part of us, very much part of us. Water is a living cultural and spiritual entity that cannot be reduced to a mere resource. So here I just wanted to suggest some differences in worldviews from a Western scientific approach to water. There's a tendency, and I say a tendency, I don't think this is always true across the line, but across the board, but I think that part of the reason we're dealing with the ecological crisis we're dealing with now, which is partly a water crisis, is the problem of objectifying water, which Western science has tended to do. That water is something to be used, to be controlled, and that water is valued for its usefulness. So water, and it's the same with land. Water is a thing, in a sense, that we as humans can use for our benefit, but we don't ever think of it as anything that's alive. Whereas an Indigenous approach to water is a being, it's a spirit that it's a spirit that we are in relationship to. And so to think about water is to think about what our relationship means, what our relationship to water is. So this idea of the separation between water and self is not hard and fixed, but it's fluid and relational. And there's this interesting story by this woman named Gail Small, a Northern Cheyenne activist, and she gives this example, which really, again, highlights the difference in worldviews. She says, and I'm quoting here, "Water is the lifeblood of the people. I recall taking a draft tribal water code for public input into 5 villages on my reservation when I was a tribal sociologist. Protection of the water spirits was the major concern throughout the reservation, and the water spirits varied depending on the water source being a river, a lake, or a spring. So I reported back to the attorneys that I was working with, and they laughed at my findings. However, it was no laughing matter a few years later when an elderly Cheyenne man held off a drilling team of the company Arco, from crossing his water spring. He told me how the water spirits sometimes came out and danced in his spring. There is a profound spiritual dimension to our natural environment, and without that spiritual dimension, the war would not be worth fighting." So this is a quote from a Cheyenne activist who's working with the people from her reservation in terms of water and water protection. But again, that highlights, I think, the differences in worldview. That water is, for Indigenous peoples, there's spirits in water that educate us and teach us and that we're in relationship with. But from a Western perspective, that just seems a bit ridiculous. So this is an image of the Mother Earth Water Walk, or Women's Water Walk. So in April 2003 was the first annual Women's Water Walk. And it was 2 Anishinaabe grandmothers and a group of Anishinaabe women and men who walked around Lake Superior. So I think that was, I forget how many miles that is, but it took quite a long time for them to walk along the border of Lake Superior. But again, it's because of the grandmothers and the women, again, in Cree society and in Anishinaabe society and I think many societies, women hold special responsibilities for water. Women are the life givers, and as such, they hold a sacred status for their, in the sense of this, their responsibility and their ability to protect and educate about water. And so these grandmothers and these other women and some men also joined along for these walks. And the walks around the Great Lakes. So in 2003, they walked around Lake Superior. In 2004, they walked around Lake Michigan. 2005, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario in 2006, and then Lake Erie in 2007. So these walks were meant to raise awareness that our clean and clear water is being polluted. It's being polluted by chemicals, vehicle emissions, motorboats, sewage disposal, agricultural pollution, leaking land sites, and residential use. So all these things are taking its toll on the quality of our water. So water is precious and sacred. It is one of the basic elements needed for all life to exist, as we know. And so these water walks, these women have taken responsibility for going on these water walks, and they continue today. And they very often happen in the spring, because the symbolism of the spring is this idea of a natural regrowth of our natural habitat. So spring is a time of renewal, regrowth, and rebirth. So the women water walkers in the spring continue to walk to raise awareness about the importance of protecting our waters and the importance of cleaning our waters. So everything is water, says Pauline Shirt, who's one of the water walkers. Everything is water, everything. So women, again, are the keepers of the water. So the importance of water to human beings, I mean, we know that we ourselves are around 60% water. Water quenches our thirst, it cleanses us, it nourishes our spirits, and we would not survive without water. So our relationship with water, I want to speak a little bit about this a little bit more. Relationship itself defines who we are as creatures in this world. Not only humans, but all creatures, whether it's the four-legged, as Black Elk says, or the two-legged, or the winged beings, etc. We are all in relationship. It defines who we are. So relationship, and our relationship is intimately connected to the land. And again, when I say land, I'm also speaking about water. So it's intimately connected to the land and water we come from. It's connected to the ceremonies that express who we are as a people. And it is our connection with every other being and with the creator of all beings. So relationship, you may be familiar, some of you may have experienced ceremonies, Indigenous ceremonies, and you'll maybe have noticed that there's often this expression at the end of a ceremony, all our relations. And that's really this deep understanding that we are relational beings. We're not, first of all, autonomous, and then we are in relationship, but we are relationships. It's who we are, it's who we intrinsically are. Is a relationship. And so we are in relationship with all other beings. So Indigenous worldviews see everything and everyone as related, including all that has been and all that is to come. So Indigenous peoples often talk about their ancestors, and they continue to be in relationship with their ancestors. Their ancestors continue to teach them, and they also are in relationship with those who are yet to come. And so the importance of being responsible for those who are yet to come. So that idea of 7 generations back and 7 generations into the future, that we are in relationship to all these peoples, and we have a responsibility. So this is a quote from June Ann Greeley from a really excellent article called Water in Native American Spirituality. She says a body of water, for example, is meant to be where it is, but it is believed to exist on more than a simple axis of space and time. That body of water in Indigenous spirituality embodies the stories and narratives of the history of that place, not interchangeable with any other place. And it evokes the real and mythic accounts of whomever or whatever has encountered that place. So again, I come back to that idea of the local, the importance of being situated in this place, on this land. You'll probably have noticed often when Indigenous peoples introduce themselves, they first of all introduce who they are, the people they come from, the land they come from. That's because their whole identity is really created and rooted in the land, in the territory that they come from, and the culture, which also comes from that land, in that place. So our relationship with water, again, there's a consciousness of the sacred that has always permeated Indigenous worldviews because of the tradition of orality. So the oral tradition has always been important. And as I said earlier, when I was talking about the Cree word and the Anishinaabe word, Nibai, Indigenous languages are verb-based, and the meaning of the word is in the sound itself. Thus, to speak of water is to connect with the powers within water, to conjure these powers up. For Indigenous peoples, water is a living being. Water is as aware of us as we are aware of water. So that's interesting. And I was thinking about an Anishinaabe writer whose name is Patty Krawick. And Patty was, her father was Anishinaabe and her mother was Ukrainian. When she was born on the Lac Saul First Nation, which is near Sault Ste. Marie. And she lived her first 3 or 4 years on the reservation there and on the First Nation there. And then I guess her parents split up and her mother took her to southern part of Ontario, and that's where she grew up. She grew up disconnected from her Indigenous roots, very much like the 60s Scoops, but she was taken by her own mother. But later in life, when she was in her 20s, she reconnected with her father and she went back to the Lac Seul First Nation. And she wanted just to kind of explore it and see what she remembered, see what she could remember from her early first years. And she says that when she was walking around the land and the water, she put her hands into the water. And when she did that, she said she had a physical reaction. She said she felt remembered. She said, I was not the only one who was remembering. She felt connected to that place in a way not connected to anywhere else. So it was so interesting what she said, that she felt the water. She didn't just remember the water, but she felt the water remembered her. She had that visceral feeling that the water was remembering her. So this idea that when I say that water as a living being is as aware of us as we are aware of water, that's kind of what I mean, that experience that she had. Josephine Mandamin, who was also one of the water walkers, one of the first water walkers, she passed away in 2019. She said, water has to live. Water can hear. It can sense what we're saying. It can really, really speak to us. Some songs come to us through water. We have to understand that water is very precious. So I wanted just to end by talking a little bit about the significance of water in Indigenous creation stories. First of all, again, I just repeat that water is the essence of all life, both material and spiritual. And I also, again, to repeat that the power of water is both positive and negative. It's both life-giving and life-ending. And this positive and negative dimension of water often appears in First Nations or Indigenous creation stories. Very often there's this ambiguousness to water. It's both, for example, there's this story from the West Coast where I come from, where the interior Salish people believe that in the water are these water babies, and that if they want to go onto the water to fish, they have to feed these water babies. And so what they do is they make this little canvas basket, and they put food into it and medicines into it, and then they sink it to the bottom of the lake or the river where they're fishing. And that is their sort of way of acknowledging the water babies and feeding them, and they know that by doing that they'll have safe passage and they'll have a good fishing experience. So that you see in that kind of ambiguousness about water, because if they didn't feed the water babies, there would be a concern that something would happen, that something dangerous would happen within the water, and that the fishing would not be as good. So you can see in that story that idea of positive and negative elements. Also for Indigenous peoples, water sources are inhabited by sacred and supernatural entities like those water babies that endow water with spiritual and supernatural powers. Water, bodies of water, and places of water occur as characters and settings in many Indigenous mythologies. The sacred narratives are fundamental to an understanding of the world for Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous nations that have their own set of sacred narratives, recounting their own unique encounter with the presence and legacy of water and water-related occasions. And as I said, many First Nations creation oral history cycles between when there was just water on the earth, so as a primal substance. So I'm thinking about, for example, the Haudenosaunee creation story, the Iroquois creation story. So here you have an example of the story. I just will briefly convey it. Won't take too long, just a minute to sort of tell. The story is about a woman who lives in the sky world. So the Haudenosaunee understand that there's this world and the sky world. And the sky world is where we'll eventually all go when we pass from this world. And so there's a woman in the sky world who's pregnant, and she feels ill, and so she wants to get medicines from the plants to take so that she'll feel better. And so she goes to the plants and she starts digging, and her brother comes to help, and he starts digging, and he digs a really big hole. Anyway, she's curious, and she looks inside the hole, and she falls into the hole, and by falling into the hole, she keeps falling. She ends up falling down to this world, and this world is only water in that creation story. And she lands, the birds protect her from falling too hard, but she lands on the back of a turtle, but she looks around and she realizes there's nowhere to live, there's no land. And so she asked the animals that are surrounding her if they could swim down into the water to get a piece of earth and bring it up so that she could begin to plant some of the seeds that she brought from her world when she was falling. She had grabbed some seeds. So these little animals try to dive down into the ocean to get the earth, and eventually one of them does bring up some earth, and she takes that earth, she lays it out on the back of the turtle, and eventually it spreads out and spreads out and spreads out, and that's how the earth was created for the Haudenosaunee people. And so you see in that story again the presence of water. That water is the primal substance here, and out of water comes the land. And you may have often heard Indigenous people, especially in North America, talk about Turtle Island. Well, that's where that expression comes from. There's also West Coast nations flood stories, and I won't go into those, but the essential idea there is that people, because of a flood, people were brought by the flood to live in the territory that they live on. For example, in the Gitskan creation oral tradition, they speak about a flood that brings the Gitskan people to the territory, which is in the northwestern British Columbia, where they live. And there's a mountain there that's actually called Where the Canoe Landed During the Flood. That's the name of the mountain. It's a Gitskan word but that's what the word means. So it's quite interesting. So we see then how water is really encompassed within many Indigenous origin stories, and many stories, water plays a huge significance. So I'll just end with just this quote from Junan Greeley. For Indigenous peoples, then, as for most Indigenous spiritualities, water retains an honored and indispensable place, an actual force, as well as a symbolic image of life and death, creation and destruction, nourishment and deprivation. Water exists as an autonomous and primal element to be encountered with humility, respect, joy, and caution. Thanks. I'll just stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was an enormously rich presentation. We're going to have questions and answers later, and discussion where you can put up your hand or just write in the chat area. But before we get to that, we're going to have Tom McAuley's presentation. And Tom, here you go. And Tom, you really should unmute yourself. Otherwise, we just look at the screens.
Can you hear me all now?
Yeah, there's a very good reason we can. You're unmuted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the UN theme for World Water Day this year is Water for Peace, or Water and Peace. And so we have a double whammy challenge here, because we wanted to really handle water and peace and Western and Indigenous thought and values about water. And so here we go. We're going to get into the discussion after this. Oh, there it is. Okay, there was a menu stopping me. So I basically have two parts to my presentation. Water and peace, and we'll talk about global transboundary watersheds and conflicts and conflict history over water. We'll talk about preventing and resolving water conflicts with the example of the International Joint Commission, and then a closer look into Indigenous and Western thought and culture, and then we get into our discussions. Just wanted to start with the fact that Nipi, as Christine said, water is life, I am life. It's the life of the whole community of living beings on Earth, and including 8.1 billion humans, 2 billion of whom have very poor access to clean water. And there are incredible issues about water globally, but there are also 286 basins that are shared by 153 countries around the world. You can see them on the map here. And these basins create interdependencies of connected ecosystems, but of social, economic, and political interdependencies as well between the different countries over the water in the basins. And there are conflict factors that exist, of course. There can be poor or unjust water management. There can be good treaties or no treaties or bad treaties in place. Of course, political stress and water stress, drought and global heating, which is a cross-cutting factor around the world. The Pacific Institute has put together the most comprehensive database of conflict over water. They've had researchers on this for quite a while, 20 years or more. So this gives you an idea of where all the water conflicts have happened globally. But one of their comments, and they've got lots of analysis on their website, is that there's a clear worsening trend of water-related violence during recent decades. And in that map, you'll note that it says water as a root cause of conflict, and that could be disagreement over water use, sharing, or over water facts. They say, we say. Water as a weapon in conflict, or water as a casualty of conflict. And I have some examples, just a few to bring it to your mind. You probably are aware of them. The Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Water was used as a weapon in conflict in the breaching of the Kharkova Dam on the Dnieper River in June of 2023. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, now war. Not many people know that water has been a huge cause behind the scenes ever since 1948, but it's grown since the 1993 Oslo Accords, which entrenched Israel's control over Palestine's water access. So Palestinians paying 3 times as much for their water, and they have to apply if they want a new well, and that doesn't always come through. And they have unreliable water. They consider this as water theft. And in 2023, water was used, October, as a weapon of war in the total blockade of Gaza, including a ban on food and water. There's a good source for those of you who want to look further into this, and I can't see it because of the photos here. How can I get rid of the photos? Watershed, the role of fresh water in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, by David Brooks, who lives here in Ottawa. And so there's a lot of sound research on this water problem. And if there ever is to be, God help us, that we hope there will be a peace and some truth and reconciliation, water has to be on the table as one of the important factors. So how can we prevent conflicts and build peaceful relations in transboundary waters? Now I'm going into this long-standing successful example, the International Joint Commission, which was created by the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty. The treaty was between the US and Great Britain on behalf of Canada. And it's an exceptional treaty found in the IJC, and there are few like it in the world. The IJC mission as a unitary binational organization, as independent advisor to both governments, to prevent and resolve disputes, and to pursue the common good of both countries. So looking into the guiding principles, number 4 and 5, to work collegially as a single integrated body, joint fact-finding, in openness, honesty, objectivity, using well-founded science. Now, compared to a lot of water committees, joint water committees between several countries, including the one that was created in the Oslo Accords between for the Jordan and the watersheds in the Middle East, if they're not insulated and at arm's length from their sponsoring government, then as soon as politics go bad, there's some political stress, they become non-functional. They're called back. They're not at the table. And that's one of the amazing things about having an independent unitary organization. So a quote from the guiding principles: a single integrated body working collegially in a spirit of openness, mutual trust, and confidence, and in the common interest of both countries. So I would love to see, and I think a lot of people would love to see, more transboundary basin institutions that have this kind of a spirit to them. And the IJC, since 1909, has handled hundreds of issues and several conflicts, and only twice in that history of over 100 years have the Canadian and US commissioners filed separate briefs to their own governments. And I'll give you, there's a photo of the commissioners in 2019. And the three commissioners on the left, Henry Lickers is Haudenosaunee from Akwesasne. Meryl Ellen Farr has worked a long time with natives in Yukon and in the West, and she wrote a book on water ethics. Pierre Belin from Quebec, and I know him. I know all three of them, actually. The three US commissioners, named by the president and seconded by the Senate, are there as well. So the watersheds between Canada and the US are seen on this map. There's about 9,000 kilometers of boundary between the two countries, including when you include Alaska, Yukon. And I just wanted to give you a very rapid example, but this goes into the Haudenosaunee participation as well. The Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River study that it was one of my principal responsibilities between 2000 and 2005. It was a 50-year update of IJC regulation of the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario. Science has changed, the knowledge has changed about the system, and that's why they were doing it. You see at the bottom right-hand corner, the Moses Saunders Dam, which all the water coming out of the Great Lakes and going down the St. Lawrence passes through this dam. And half of it belongs to the New York Power Authority, the other half to Ontario Hydro. The study itself Of course, there's transboundary waters shared by Canada, the US, Ontario and Quebec on the Canadian side. Of course, the languages of this study were English and French. New York State on the US side. Indigenous peoples at Akwesasne, St. Regis, Ganawagi, and Tyendinaga. The interests or direct stakeholders in the system. Now, the dam was built in the 1950s as well as the locks, and this was like a 100-year-old dream to have commercial navigation going between the ocean and the Great Lakes all the way up to Superior. And the Queen Elizabeth and the President and Prime Minister were there in 1958, I believe it was, for the grand opening of the locks. But the IJC part is the regulation of water going through this dam. And of course, there's the interest, commercial navigation, you've got recreational boating and fishing and tourism, you've got the environment, especially wetlands, you've got municipal, industrial, and domestic water use. You'll see some of the cities around like Toronto, and shoreline processes, erosion, flooding, and destruction of property. So engaging 150 experts approximately for a 5-year study is not a simple thing. And I'm doing this, actually, I wanted to highlight this study for 2 reasons. And the first being, of course, that there is complexity in managing water. And of course, the larger the watershed and the more transnational, the more complex it is. But the second thing is to show Indigenous participation in this study. So below the International Joint Commission, there's a study board, public interest advisory group, 6 technical working groups at the bottom, and 3 others for plan formulation, evaluation, hydrology, This is called the study team. And the challenge was to have everyone meet together at the same time and have shared vision modeling. So everybody knows what's going on in the modeling. It's transparent and there's no black boxes. You put in the data and out come the results. And for Indigenous participation, there were 2 study board members from Akwesasne and St. Regis, and the Akwesasne Task Force on the Environment worked for part of the study. And of course, there were First Nation dedicated public meetings throughout the study and at the end. Just to show something about the comprehensiveness, of course, the hydrology, 101 years of historical record, but that will never repeat itself. And so that was extended to 50,000 years by stochastic extension, Monte Cassino simulations. I won't get into the technical stuff, but to see exactly how varied and how high the highs would be and the lows would be. And you can see a zipper diagram here. The report, which I have, is full of all kinds of interesting graphs for those that like it. Climate change futures models were used from Canada, US, Germany, UK, and Japan. And that was also considered because you're looking into the future. You're looking into a 50-year future period. And so at least 20 plans were formulated, but the top 5 were tested through the 50,000 years of hydrological variability. And right here on the graph, you can see Montreal Harbor levels at the levels that are exceeded only 1% of the time at the top, at the mean, and at those that are exceeded 99% of the time. You might call this the 1 in 100 high and 1 in 100 low. So, but that was done all along the system, not just at Montreal, of course, Lake Ontario. Now, getting into the report, the final report had 9 pages dedicated to the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address called Words Before All Else. And I just wanted to show you a bit of it here. And you'll notice that it's in English, in French, and also in Mohawk language on the right. And just to give you a little bit of an example of it, let's start with the greetings to the people. Today we have gathered, and we see that the cycles of life continue. We have been given the duty to live in balance and harmony with each other and all living things. So now we bring our minds together as one, and we give greetings and thanks to each other as people. Now our minds are one. It goes on. To Earth Mother, we are thankful to our mother, the earth, for she gives us all that we need for life. And that continues. And then it continues with thanksgiving for each of the waters, the fish, the plants, the food plants, the medicine herbs, the animals, the trees, the birds, the four winds, the thunderers, the sun, grandmother moon, the stars, and the enlightened teachers. And so there was a whole different fresh breath in the study. And I've seen in the water professional circles and in conferences a greater, let's say, a converging and an appreciation of Indigenous values more and more over the decade that I was active there. And so I just want to take a further look into Indigenous and Western thought and culture. And Christine, you mentioned the water ceremonies. Two things on that, okay? My t-shirt comes from the Silks people in the Okanagan Valley. And I had the good fortune, because I had 3 boards in British Columbia, the good fortune of attending the return of the salmon ceremony. So the salmon that come all the way up through the Columbia and up the Okanagan. And it was a beautiful occasion with a meal and with the whole community and the guests, like I was one of them. And this is a salmon on my t-shirt, and it says, protecting the sacredness of the river. So there's just one point. And before I go further, I met Grandma Josephine Mandamin in La Crosse, Wisconsin in 2015 at the first water ethics conference. And there was a little water liturgy that we had that was wonderful. She's from Manitoulin Island with Wemikong. So this is thanks to Robert Doran, who passed away 3 years ago now, a Jesuit who has published very much as a Lonergan scholar, but a scholar in his own right, not only with his books, but he founded the International Institute for Method and Theology, of which I'm a member. And he identifies 2 basic elements in cultural constitutive meanings. The cosmological culture, where the measure of integrity lies in the rhythms of non-human nature, and it moves from these rhythms through the community to individuals. And I chose to represent that with the art of an Ojibwe, William Monagway. It blows me away. It's part of I think my artistic conversion. And then anthropological culture, which Doran identifies, shapes the social order not on a cosmological principle, but on a principle of reason. The human is then the measure of all things, and the shape of the social order is no longer a fixed reflection of the cosmic order, but is instead a human creation, pliable and ever reformable. And once again, I chose this work of art by Gustave Boulanger in 1861 as a representative. A look at the past 4 centuries of what I call alienation amidst increasing technological progress. 1620 and 1641, we have Francis Bacon, René Descartes, with the idea of conquering nature, and Descartes become like masters and possessors of nature. Now, first, I want to distinguish, they're among the founders of scientific method, but scientific method is framed within a framework of philosophical values and culture and thought. And it reflects the thought of the time, but there was a whole process that moved through modernity in the last 4 centuries. And for this, I turn to the very astute analysis of Leo Strauss, who speaks of the 3 waves of modernity. And he looks at many of the major authors that affected political philosophy and the way we do politics. And there's a whole line here that moves through liberalism and through Marxism and right through to fascism. But I can't follow his line on this right now because it's too complex. But Fred Lawrence, who's at Boston College and who is a friend, examined all of Strauss's work, but he did it also turning to Bernard Lonergan's portrait of the subject as being neglected in the ancient and medieval world, as being truncated, as with the liberalism, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, as being immanentized from Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, and Marx, and then as being alienated in the postmodern Nietzsche, Heidegger, where there are no foundations for values. We cannot say how you can get an ought out of an is. But if you look back in this, the modernity, Hobbes himself was known for saying that nature is red in tooth and claw, and human beings have to protect themselves. And Locke it was all about protecting the individuals, particularly those that are the most powerful. And what Fred Lords called these languages of modernity, because languages surround us, they're like the water we live in, the air we breathe, and they in a way form our thinking and our expressions. Modernity 1 as possessive individualism, modernity 2 as expressive individualism. There's romanticism in there, but there's no sound epistemology, no sound way of knowing how we know, no sound way of knowing who we are as subjects, our inner self, and postmodern as relative perspectivism. So you can see how we can move into an era of post-truth when everything is a relative perspective. And I'm sorry I went a bit fast, but just for the sake of the audience, now is the time for our overall discussion and questions. Shall I stop my share? I will.
Yes, please. And I'm going to share my screen, and here we go. There we are. Okay, so you can use the chat box to write something, and I'll moderate that. Or you can raise your hand, you know where that is. There's a panel somewhere called reactions. On my screen, it's not popping up here, but any case, yeah, here we go. So while I wait for somebody to pose a question, I'll just ask one factual question of you, Tom. In one of the first slides where it showed worldwide water conflicts worked out, I think the research was done by the Pacific Institute. I didn't notice any within Canada. Was that because everything's defined in terms of modern political boundaries? Because one would assume that there was conflicts here and there among Indigenous peoples within what is now Canada. And that then becomes also a question for Christine. The allied question that I had is, how would Indigenous understandings of water inform a conflict between two different First Nations with respect to a water issue? So in effect, I think what I'm asking you is if all First Nations share the kind of views that you were expressing, and you didn't say that this was universal and uniform, but that there was a great deal of similarity. But nevertheless, I would find it hard to imagine that there were never any conflicts over water between two different neighboring groups. So over to you, Tom, just to understand the map, and then Christine, whether you think that's a legitimate question or not.
Okay, it depends on where they have their sources from written sources. And there may have been conflicts that were unwritten and undetectable. There was one conflict that I was aware of between Montana and Alberta and Saskatchewan over the St. Mary and Milk Rivers, which are joined by a canal. And the governor of Montana wrote a letter to the International Joint Commission asking them to look into and change the regulation of these waters, how much goes to Alberta, how much goes to Montana. Because so anyways, I won't get into the details of that, but I was part of that process of ironing that out, as well as two very, very wonderful and savvy commissioners. But before you go to Christine, I just want to let you know that 70% of water globally is used for irrigation, for agriculture. Okay, so take that out of the picture, and that the population of the earth before at 1800 was only 1 billion, and then less than that, of course, before 1800. So on to you, Christine.
Yeah, so I'm not aware of any specific conflicts over water. I know that there's certainly in the past that there was fighting among different nations, different First Nations, and but my experience in terms of what I've explored and what I come to understand is that in First Nations people tend to be, or Indigenous people tend to be fairly generous with their resources. Like I know, for example, when I mean, there's lots of evidence that when the first contact was made, Indigenous peoples reached out and helped the settlers, helped the colonizers. Well, they weren't called that then, the visitors, and shared their resources, shared their knowledge. But I'm sure there have been conflicts about land and water from the past. I know that there was, different battles between different First Nations First Peoples, I would say, on the West Coast before contact. But I don't really know. I'm ignorant about understanding how they settled water claims. I think I sort of see a little bit of a kind of one extreme is the generosity and the sharing, and the other extreme is the exclusion of different groups. And I think that has happened in the past, that certain groups, Indigenous groups, have fought and taken over the land and the water of other groups. I know that's happened in the past, but I don't know if there was ever negotiation. I'm sure there must have been negotiation that went on between First Nations or First Peoples over water and land, but I just can't give you an example of that.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a couple of questions. One person asked, who were the philosophers in the postmodern phase? Are they mainly Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre?
Yes, they are mainly Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre, although I only had the first two on the graph.
I see. And probably that's the beginning of a much longer study or question. And then here's a question which perhaps both of you could try to address. How do you balance economic needs to use water with philosophical morality of protecting it? What do you do when money drowns out a conversation?
That's a really good question, Rob. And first of all, it depends where you are in the world and who has the money and what's going on there. But to go to the examples that I am aware of in our studies at the International Joint Commission and in solving problems, water, first of all, is not static. Water is moving through the system, the hydrological cycle. It's being replenished and it's moving downstream, at least in these rivers, this fresh water, including the Great Lakes. And there have been a lot of efforts to protect water, those that wanted to move Great Lakes water out of the basin, even down to the dry Southwest Texas, wherever, where all of the states and the Canadian provinces got together in a compact to protect the waters of the Great Lakes from that being done. In our studies in the IJC, you've got some of the interests have a lot of clout, like commercial navigation. There's 10,000 ships a year that come up to the Port of Montreal, and about 2,000 ships, 2,500 that move from Montreal through to the Great Lakes and back. And they and the hydropower have clout, and the Americans around Rochester have a lot of political clout. They see their lands being eroded somewhere between 30 centimeters and 3 meters a year on average.
Wow.
And they've put in rocks all over. I think 40% of the lake has had riprap rock and protection put in. And so it's a delicate balance, because there are people that are crying back to their politicians. And yet I think the way the study was, we had a sound study board that had a civilized conversation about all of this. And for instance, they didn't put an economic value on nature. So the wetlands and environment, they didn't say, even though we had resource economists in the study, they didn't say, well, let's turn it all into what value would it have at dollar-wise? They said, no, we'll evaluate the economic interests economically, and if it's 5 million a year or whatever, we'll do that. But the environment is its own thing, and it was the largest group in the study. So there are ways with good treaties, and of course, the IJC adopted an ecosystem approach at least 25 years ago or 30 years ago. So there are ways of countering it, at least between Canada and the US. In other countries, it'd be a different story for anywhere else in the world, I think.
It sounds like there's no automatic answer to that. And in a sense, the answer has to come before the question. You have to have that commitment in place in order to reach that kind of an understanding. Christine, could you comment on this question as well?
Yeah, well, I liked what you said, Bob, because I think that one of the things that I've come to understand is that indigenous worldviews, indigenous perspectives, even when what Tom talked about in the words that come before all else, the Haudenosaunee people, try to imagine really living that reality, that we are grateful to Mother Earth. We're grateful to all the four-leggeds, to the bird, the two wings, et cetera, the water, the land, et cetera. How that would shape your thinking in terms of how we go about, using the resources, that we need in order to live. I think that what's called for in terms of balancing the economic thrust and the need to protect the water and the land is the need for what Lonergan would call a conversion experience. And what he means by that is really a shifting of horizons of value, what we value and what we care about. And I think that what I find so admirable about many Indigenous peoples that I've encountered, and these are many different nations, many different traditions, that there is a respect and a humility about our relationship with water and with land and with everything that these are gifts that we're given. And what I tried to show in my presentation is that idea of ownership is so foreign. It's really foreign to an Indigenous worldview. Certainly, I'm not saying that Indigenous peoples don't own houses and stuff like that, but that idea of owning land and owning water is, it's owned by the people, by a community. It's not an individual ownership. And I think that different way of thinking is what's called for in the crisis that we're dealing with today. I would say that, Tom talked a little bit about it, I think, even in terms of the water ceremony that he experienced at that environmental conference, and speaking to people who are part of the Women's Water Walk, and just their whole sense of the value and the preciousness of the resources that we've been given as a gift from the Creator. And these resources are more than just resources. They are beings that we are in relationship with. And if we think about it that way, our use of these resources would be quite different, I think. So I think, what's called for in terms of that standoff between economic development and the need to protect the land and the water is really a shift in our thinking. I think that has to happen. And I think the Indigenous peoples have something very valuable to teach us about the kind of shift that needs to happen.
Thank you. Christine brings up the point that the Magpie River in Quebec was granted legal personhood in 2021, she thinks. Is this kind of an expression of what you were just talking about, Christine?
Kind of is, but it was granted personhood, and it kind of is, as long as it doesn't. See, I think that the only hesitation I have is this idea of individualism, the predominance of individualism in terms of our understanding of personhood. And as long as there's an understanding that waterway it can be considered a person and we are in relationship with it, but it's the relationship that's prior to its personhood, in a sense, to its individuality. And I just think we can't forget that dimension that is so important, because I think that that's part of where the Western kind of perspective has maybe, like, we live as individuals, as autonomous beings, and we focus on individual rights, and that kind of thinking is problematic. And I think that kind of thinking, without realizing our relationship to all beings and to each other, I think that can lead us into the kind of situation that we're faced with today, the kind of the disconnect between our relationship, the disconnect from our relationship to all other beings and water So so in some ways, I think that's good, that idea of the personhood of the waterway. But I just I just have a little bit of caution about the kind of philosophy that's behind it. That's all.
Bob, may I comment?
Yes, please do.
This question from Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson, it's a very good one. And I looked into this a while back as well during my thesis. And the first river that I was aware of that was given the status of personhood was a river in New Zealand. And there are good and bad aspects to this, but in New Zealand, I think it was a good one. Because in spite of what you said, Christine, the fish and the water don't talk. And when you have hearings and when you have plans, they need someone to talk for them. And in our study, the biggest group was the environmental group, and you have ecologists and biologists, and those that are studying and understanding what is going on and what the trends are. And they can speak for the water and for the environment. They gave in New Zealand the custodianship of the Person River to the Maori. And that was an excellent thing to do. They are protectors of water. And I'm aware that another river in India was given status of personhood. And it was the Ganges and the Yamuna, I think, or was it the Yamuna itself? Now, I wondered who's going to speak for the water, because as you know, you wouldn't want to immerse yourself in the waters which have such high bacterial counts and everything else. And they gave it to a department of the government. And I don't know if it's as effective as some ministries of the environment and some, but if you have bureaucrats that are supposed to be speaking for the water and lawyers that are supposed to be speaking for the water, you say, well, the water's not in good hands. You know, you'd be worried about it. And so for the Magpie River, once again, this may be good, this may not be. It depends on who is given to speak the voice of the waters to the government and to the power actors and to everybody else.
Thank you, Tom, for adding that. Here's a very concrete, practical question. What do you two think about the bottling of spring water?
Who goes first?
Well, I mean, I think it's a little bit scandalous, to tell you the truth. I think that, I mean, it's bottled by companies that make huge profits from resources that belong. I mean, it's very often not the people of that live on what land and where that water is that benefit from the bottling of water. It's and I can't even imagine Indigenous peoples thinking along that line, although they certainly use bottled water for sure. I see it at meetings and stuff, but I just, from my perspective, I just have a lot of problems with bottled water. I have a lot of problems because it's these certain companies, international conglomerates that so-called own this water and sell this water for a huge profit. That bothers me a lot. I don't know how you feel about it.
I'd look at it from a global perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that well over 90% of any bottled water should not be bottled. The 500 milliliter bottles that we have that are in the stores and everything else, especially because plastic needs to be eliminated. And there's so much plastic pollution in the world, and there's microplastics all over the place, including in our bodies. But if you look at pictures of third world countries or undeveloped countries where people have to walk to get water and carry it, of course, they've got big plastic jugs, and they need those big plastic jugs. Just like I think we're on a well here, and we use a 18.9 liter jugs for certain things because the hardness of the water makes your coffee machine malfunction and all everything else. But in humanitarian crises, and I think even in Gaza now, how are people surviving? I think the nations that are helping, they arrive first of all with water, with clean water. That's the first thing that people need. And I remember in Haiti during the drought, this is way back, coming in with a boatload of these cases of bottled water. You have to get the water there somehow and to the people fast. And so I would say that is the one thing that I think is the only, probably the most worthy use of bottled water.
Yeah, good point.
Thank you, Tom. Kirsten had a further remark about there being many passages in the Old Testament, including quite distinctly the Psalms, where there's talk of water. Do either of you have any remarks about that? I mean, she just noted that, but it's an interesting facet to talk about.
Well, where there's talk of water, did you say?
Yeah, in the
I
Old
know,
Testament.
yeah, I mean, I find the Old Testament, it's interesting in terms of when you look at some of the Psalms and some of the writings in the prophets, they talk about the water being alive, and they, it having spirits in a sense. And so I find it very similar to a lot of indigenous thinking. And these were indigenous people, I guess, in their own way. And yeah, so I mean, that's one thing I've really noticed a lot is the kind of similarities and how, all of creation, sings out to the Lord, sings out to God, sings out to Yahweh, that kind of idea. And and water was very precious in certainly in terms of the Old Testament, I think, but I'm not an expert there for sure. What do you think, Tom?
All the way through the Bible, from start to finish, I forget how many 400 or 500 references to water.
Yeah,
Kristen is speaking about the Psalms here. And I think the one that comes to mind is, there is a river that makes glad the city of God, the streams of the river that make glad the city of God. But the waters clapping their hands for joy, like you were saying, Christine, in praise, let God be praised by all his creatures, by all things. But there's water giving life, which is part of your thing, Nipi, I am life.
yeah.
In Ezekiel 47, the water coming out of the temple and getting deeper and deeper and deeper, nourishing all the trees which have all the fruit and leaves for the life of the nations. And right to the very end, in the end of the Revelation, Apocalypse, the stream of living waters, and of course Jesus speaking about living waters, it's used very metaphorically, but water is so central to all of these, about God, like God's life flowing.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just refer to one last remark in the chat, where Janice points out that that sea turtles are dying in the oceans when their flippers get stuck in waste bottles. They can't swim and therefore drown. So they are drowning because of our love of convenience of plastic bottles. Thank you, Janice. Um, I just want to thank our speakers. For myself, this started with a question I had about traditional ethics, and it grew and became much deeper with our two speakers. So I personally thank you, but I'm also going to turn it over now to my colleague Pamela Dixon to add her thanks on our behalf.
Thanks, Bob. Wow. What a wonderfully life-giving presentation on the diversity of perspective of water in our lives. I was struck that in Tom's presentation, there was an abundance of facts, which I love. Being a scientist myself, I enjoy hearing all the facts. And to me, the interesting thing was the discussion of the movement of human thinking through the three modernities, and possibly into a fourth, if there's something in the future, going from individualisms, various forms of individualisms, to relative perspectivisms, which suggests to me that we are slowly adopting what our Indigenous brothers and sisters have been thinking for a long time, and returning to a state of relationship rather than individualism. And Tom had a beautiful example of the Joint Council, International Joint Council, using both Western and Indigenous thinking in order to show how they can be melded together to do good work. And so as I finish, thanking both Christine and Tom for their work, I wanted to express the hope that all of us who have been in this time of listening will go from our own area of individualism to our own level of Zagi Idi Win. And I hope I said that correctly. My German caught right in there and I didn't know how to say all those letters, but apologies if I said that wrong. That we are all looking for unconditional love between ourselves and our non-humans, brothers and sisters, and creation. So I think we have a little bit of way to go, but our eyes are open to that. And so I again thank our speakers for their wonderful discussion and the questions that we had.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. I'm very
Thank you.
impressed with how you managed that. So thank you everyone who attended and all who later on will take an interest in the recording, which will be on the St. Basil's website. So this concludes our gathering today, except I see two more things here in the chat. Several people have expressed their thanks, and I really do appreciate that you've said, oh, here's one thing. I'm especially grateful for the inclusion of the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address, which this lady has read many times and grown to love. Okay, well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Christine, and Miigwech. Bye-bye for now, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye.